Hannah and Bill and Stephen for inviting me, and thank you everybody for coming along. Just a bit of background, I came across Hannah Rigby some years ago when I was researching for my book Ship of Death, and I'll show you a picture. So some of you may even have come to that talk a few years ago. It was the ship Emigrant came over from England in 1850, bringing some of our earliest free settlers directly to Moreton Bay, whereas previously there had been some coming to New South Wales, but this was a government scheme to bring free settlers in to Moreton Bay to build up the population of respectable white citizens when Brisbane was in its fairly early days of free settlement. So the convict establishment had closed in over a period of time, but around 1840, and opened up to free settlement in 1842. So the Emigrant brought some government-assisted settlers out, and a typhus broke out on the voyage, and a lot of these poor passengers died on the way, and then they got quarantined at Dunwich, Stradbroke Island, when the rest of them arrived. And they were there for almost 4 months in this dreadful period of quarantine, where more of them died. And I was actually on a holiday there with my family. I think it was around 2012-ish, and we saw that beautiful cemetery. Has anyone been to the Dunwich Cemetery? It's really lovely, beautiful setting by the bay, and saw all the 26 little white crosses of those who died in quarantine. And at one end was a plaque that listed the names of the dead, and at the other end was a couple of graves. One of them was Dr. Ballow, who was the Brisbane doctor who went over to look after the sick passengers, because the young ship surgeon, George Mitchell, had fallen ill with typhus just as they arrived in Moreton Bay. So he was too sick to look after all of the people in the hospital that they'd set up. So Dr. Ballow went over eventually. There was another doctor in between. I won't tell you that whole story, but he went over to look after the sick, and he ended up dying from typhus himself and is buried there. So when I was researching for that story, I really wanted to find out more about Dr. Ballow because he features heavily in the story. And so I dug into his past a bit, and he did a lot of things. He had fingers in so many pies. Horticulture, he was magistrate, he was involved in the arts, education, all sorts, as well as being a doctor. But I discovered also his involvement with some convict incidents, and I found that he'd had convicts assigned to him as servants. And one of those was Hannah Rigby. And I came across this letter where about the time that the establishment was closing and they were sending the remainder of the convicts back to Sydney or giving them their freedom. And Hannah Rigby was the only woman convict who stayed in Moreton Bay. And I found a letter written by him that said he was appealing to the Commandant of the settlement on her behalf and saying her behaviour had been exemplary and she'd never given him any cause for distrust or complaint. And I thought, oh, this sounds interesting. This might tell us something a little bit about the compassionate side of his nature. So I looked into that further and I found a few items online, including a bit on Wikipedia, a few articles. There was an entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, which was written by Jennifer Harrison, who's just turned up, Dr. Harrison. So she'd already done some of the groundwork into Hannah Rigby. But it was interesting because what I found out was that she'd been born in Liverpool, possibly 1794, although I can't really confirm her year of birth because the early records weren't consistent. She was a seamstress and an embroiderer. She was convicted of larceny in 1821 and sentenced to 7 years transportation to New South Wales and arrived in February 1823 on the Lord Sidmouth. But the details, apart from the fact that it was larceny, we didn't know the details of her crime. When her sentence had expired, she reoffended and then was sent to Moreton Bay. at that time, see, Hannah arrived at the time when there was a bit of change in administering convicts in New South Wales. So the big report had just been released, the report into the state of things in New South Wales at the time, and that recommended harsher penalties. I think it was Big who said that transportation should strike terror into the hearts of criminals, so it should be a deterrent, where in fact some people believed that it was too soft on them, that they would be committing crimes to get out to Australia and then they'd have a better life here, and so it wasn't a deterrent. So they, as a result of that report, they established these secondary settlements, and you would have heard of Port Arthur and Norfolk Island. So they were designed to be extremely harsh, and Moreton Bay was one of them. So when she reoffended, she was sent to Moreton Bay, served her 7 years, went back to Sydney, reoffended again, and was sent back to Moreton Bay. And she was one of only 3 women who were sent to Moreton Bay twice. I also found that she had 3 sons in the colony by 3 different men, none of whom was her husband, and she did have a husband, and that she died in 1853. Now this really intrigued me because Dr. Fallow was a very brave, pioneering man, and a man of integrity, but he was also a man of his time. And the attitudes towards women who committed crime in those days was pretty rough. They were treated with much more contempt than the men were who committed similar crimes. And I thought it was interesting that a man of his background and his conventional sense of morality would speak so highly of a woman who'd offended so many times and had all these children. And so I thought, she could be an interesting person to look into further. And so that was why I wanted to uncover her story. And then it occurred to me too that there's been things written about convict women, but we don't really have many full-length biographies that really delve into their lives. Certainly not of the ordinary ones. Like we've all heard of Mary Rigby, or 1 or 2 who became successful, but not those who just lived ordinary lives of unending struggle, which is most of them. So I set myself a bit of a task to find out a few things. What was the nature of her crimes? The exact nature, not just that it was larceny. Who were the men in her life and what became of them, and what was her relationship with them, and what became of her sons? So some of the questions I was able to answer, but some can't be answered. Obviously, with historical records, they tell you the facts and the dates and the names and so on, but they often don't really tell you people's thoughts or motivations, why they do things. But just knowing a bit more about the context of the time can help us surmise why things might have gone the way they did. So I'll share with you today some of my findings. And I'll start with her life before transportation. So as I said, she was born in Liverpool. This was the post-industrial revolution. A lot of people had come from the rural areas into the town. So Liverpool was very crowded. There were a lot of slums around the docks. After slavery ended, unemployment and poverty were rife. And seamstresses weren't paid well at all. They worked very, very hard, and they found it very hard to make ends meet. At that time in the UK, there were more than 200 crimes that were punishable by death, including, I think one of them was even consorting with gypsies. It was just, but often people would be punished, even if they got sentenced to death, it would often be commuted to life imprisonment, or often juries didn't convict them because they didn't feel that it was, that the crime that they'd committed deserved execution. So anyway, she would have been poorly paid and worked very hard. But then I discovered that she'd actually committed a few crimes in England before the crime that she was transported for, which also shouldn't have surprised me because women were not often transported for a first offence. But one thing that I found that was pretty exciting, it was so her first crime was committed in 1818, first one that she was caught for. But then I found, now you probably can't read this, but I just wanted to show it because I was excited by it, and I think it's fun to look at the actual records. But this is an order from the Liverpool, the church wardens and overseers of the poor. Hannah Rigby had gone to them asking for help, financial help, to support a young son who'd been born out of wedlock. And she didn't have the means to support the child, so she was asking them to get the money from the father, who was Joseph Barrow. So I looked into Joseph Barrow, and it turns out, now, as I said, I don't know exactly how old Hannah was, but their relationship must have started when she was somewhere between 15 and 20, probably more towards the older end of that age group. He was a 46-year-old comb maker, which is a profession you don't hear of too much these days. But he was a partner in a family business that had been around for generations. It was a very well-established, lucrative business. And he'd only been married for less than a year to his second wife. His first wife had died. So he was a well-off married businessman. And she was a single, poor, lowly, young seamstress. So I can't help thinking there was quite a lot of imbalance in that relationship, imbalance of power. Anyway, so the church wardens did order him to pay some maintenance. But even if he had paid it, and I haven't been able to find any record to say whether he did, but even if he did, it was not really much to live on. I wasn't able to find out what happened to that son. He wasn't named in this order, but I strongly suspect that he died quite young. He's one of two that I think died in infancy. So I feel that this might have set Hannah off on her life of crime. She would have been struggling to survive anyway, but if she also had to look after a small child, that was much more of a financial burden, and maybe she couldn't have got work. And so that was about the time that her crimes started. Incidentally, Joseph Barrow did the same thing to another woman only 3 years later. And when he died in 1842, the Liverpool Mercury reported that he'd passed away in his 74th year, very much respected. Yeah, so he was ordered to pay 2 shillings 6 a week, but I think the average budget for a labourer around then was about 18 shillings a week. So anyway, then we have Hannah, early crimes. In January 1818, she did 3 months for larceny. That was the only one I wasn't able to find out exactly what she stole, but considering all of her crimes, I'm willing to bet it would have been a theft of haberdashery. So April 1818, so you can, if you do the maths there, you can see that as soon as she got out, she was back before the courts again and sentenced to a year for larceny. And it was from stealing from Henry Hunt. So I looked him up in the Liverpool directory, and it turns out he was a linen draper. She'd committed that crime with an older woman, Esther Cashel. Esther had a string of previous convictions for stealing, so Esther got a harsher sentence of 2 years. And Hannah served her sentence in Preston Jail near Liverpool. And then again, she was only out for a few months when she was back in jail for 2 years, this time, for stealing one ornamental feather. So feathers in those days were in very high demand. They were used in their hats and decorative. In fact, they were in such high demand that some years later they had to enact a law to prohibit the usage of feathers in hats because they were becoming endangered. So she went to Preston, House of Correction. Governor Liddell was the governor there, and he seems to have been quite a humane man who believed in reforms rather than just punishment. It was interesting actually reading all of the attitudes to crimes. Nothing really has changed. We still have this dichotomy in opinion where some people believe that the response to crime is reform and rehabilitation, and others think that punishment and deterrent is the way to go. So these things are not new. So then she only out for a blink of an eye, and then she was sentenced to 7 years transportation for stealing 2 cats and 28 yards of cotton print. 28 yards, that's a lot of fabric. You couldn't just, duck into a shop and stick it in your pocket. So, and she was actually convicted with another woman. She was in cahoots with an 18-year-old called Elizabeth Lee, who doesn't seem to have had a previous record. So Elizabeth only got 3 months when Hannah got 7 years transportation. So I can't help wondering whether maybe one of them was working in the shop and helped distract the owner, or the owner wasn't there when this theft was committed, but whatever happened, they didn't get away with it. And Hannah was held at first in the County House of Correction, Kirkdale, which was pretty new at the time. There's a picture of it there. So she was held there for about a year before she was transported. When she was in the harbour, when they finally took her down to London and put her on the Lord Sidmouth, they waited there for a few days, and they had lots of visits from people like, you would have probably heard of Elizabeth Fry and the Quakers, who used to do a lot of work trying to improve conditions for women prisoners, and also to give them moral instruction, and gave them things like sewing and embroidery to do on the voyage out. So Hannah left London in September 1822 and arrived in Port Jackson on the 27th of February 1823. The ship's surgeon was a fellow called Robert Espy. In those days, the surgeons on the long haul ships were responsible for the discipline as well as the health of their customers. And very fortunately, Espy's log has been preserved, and somebody, thank you, whoever it was, transcribed it, and it's freely available online. And that made very interesting reading, because he documented all of the little misdemeanours that the women committed on the way and the punishments that he doled out. But it's all fairly dry. It makes interesting but fairly dry reading. It doesn't really give you a lot of the sense of the mood on the ship. But then we come to this fellow, Henry Williams, Reverend Henry Williams. Do we have any New Zealanders here? Yes. Have you heard of him? Yeah, he became a very successful, well-known missionary. He learnt to speak the Maori language, and he translated the Treaty of Waitangi into Maori and convinced the chiefs to sign it. So he was actually on that voyage on his way to becoming the missionary in New Zealand, travelling with his wife and children. And they both wrote journals, and they wrote letters home afterwards that provide a lot of colour about the voyage. They both wrote a lot about the behaviour of the women and their irreverence, their body singing, their mocking attitudes to him and his sermons, their swearing. He was very, very upset by the language of the captain and the surgeon, because they swore a lot, and he felt that was teaching the women how to swear. I really feel that, yeah, these I'm pretty sure they already knew how to swear. And he told, there was one funny story, funny to me, not to him, but when there was a storm at sea, and the women who'd been mocking him all the time and crushing cockroaches during his sermons suddenly became extremely pious. But then the storm was over and they went back to their... And his wife wrote sadly that when they arrived in Sydney and farewelled the women, the poor Reverend felt that he hadn't converted a single soul. So anyway, when they arrived, Governor Brisbane had just replaced Governor Macquarie, and Governor Brisbane was much more into their assignment system and not quite as interested in reform. So he was a bit more punitive. So the surgeon's log tells us that the women were taken straight up the Parramatta River and almost certainly would have been housed at the Parramatta Female Factory. Has anybody been there? Yeah, it's really interesting. You can do little tours there, which I did. It was lovely. So that was where they put women who had been transported. They might stay there for a few days until they were sent out on assignment to a private settler, or if they had reoffended, they did something to upset their employer, they might be sent back there for punishment. They might be put in solitary on bread and water for a week. And they also went there if they were having babies. It was the only place in the colony that they could have babies. So the assignment records are pretty patchy. So we don't know for sure whether Hannah was assigned or who she was assigned to, but it's reasonably likely that she was assigned to Robert Crawford, who was a senior clerk in the government. And it's likely because she had a child and named him as the father. So Robert Crawford was an interesting fellow. He was a young Scottish man, son of a Scottish solicitor, and he wrote a lot of letters home, which also have been preserved. They're held in the National Library, and you can access them, either his handwriting online or somebody, I think a descendant, transcribed them and put them out in book form, which is great. And the letters home are really lively. They're really chatty letters. They're not just formal things. And he comes across as a very an ambitious, energetic young man. And he had very good connections. The family were personal friends of Governor Brisbane. In fact, that's probably how he got his job, because Robert's father had done Brisbane a lot of favours, and it might have been time to call in the favours. But Robert felt that he deserved everything he got in return. He had a breathtaking sense of entitlement. He even wrote in his letters when he got this good job, with underlines, "And it's no more than I deserve." So he also seems like he was quite an affectionate fellow. He had really close to his nieces and nephews, and he wrote really warm, affectionate letters. So, there may have been something appealing about him. But again, there was an incredible imbalance of power between them. And I feel that Hannah must have had some kind of affection for him. Perhaps there was a relationship there, because she named the child after him. She named her son Robert Frederick Rigby, sometimes known as Robert Frederick Crawford. But they didn't have enough of a relationship for Robert to take care of the child. So she went to the female factory to have the baby. And when the baby was only about 6 months old, she applied to marry. She had to apply for permission to marry because she was still under sentence. So there was this incredible system. As I said before, there was a really bad attitude towards women convicts. They were really, prostitution wasn't illegal. So a lot of women, that was their only recourse to prostitution. So even if they weren't, people regarded them as prostitutes. And they were really regarded with contempt. And was seen as unfeminine or unnatural to commit a crime. But the Reverend Samuel Marsden, who some of you may have heard of, was the minister for the Parramatta Female Factory, and he came up with a brainwave to establish this marriage market. And, in his view, a woman could go part of the way towards redeeming herself if she married. It didn't seem to matter who she married, but marriage gave her a certain amount of respectability. So he set up this marriage market whereby men who were either free settlers or had a ticket of leave could go to the factory. The women could line up and he would pick out some that he liked the look of, and then he was allowed to have a chat with them and see what they were like. And he could propose and they could marry. They didn't have to participate or agree to marry, but a lot of them did, because the alternative wasn't much chop. And it was, it was a gamble, but if things worked out, if they married him, then they could very likely be assigned to their husband as a servant, and then effectively they would have their freedom. But if their husband turned out to be not a very nice man, then it could go really badly, and he could have them sent back to the factory for punishment whenever he wanted. So it really was a gamble, but Hannah seems to have taken it because she applied to marry this ticket of leave man. As soon as he got his ticket of leave, he was at the factory looking for a wife. And so she married him. And yeah, his name is George Page. Now, I know you probably can't read that either, but that's his ticket of leave that just tells us a little about his background. So she married him, was effectively a free woman for a year or so. He got his official certificate of freedom then. So you think things could be looking up for them both, but then he was convicted for stealing, and so he was back in custody, and that meant she was back in custody. And my first thought when I heard this was, God, she must have been furious. They had a chance and he blew it. But then I discovered the nature of his crime. Guess what he stole? Haberdashery. So he was employed by the harbour master, and he was often seen at the docks. And there was a ship anchored there in the harbour, and a big bolt of fabric went missing. No one thought of George at first, but then they saw somebody walking around the street wearing this fabric and asked her, where did you get it from? George Page. Went to George's house, and there was the rest of it. Also, the rest of it was in various stages of being made up into clothing and curtains. And I'm pretty sure that George wouldn't have been the one to do that sewing. So it does seem very much like she was in cahoots with him, if not the ringleader. So then I had to adjust my thinking. So anyway, off he went. She was taken back. She was in Sydney jail for a bit, and she wrote this letter, and I'm showing this one because that's very likely in her own handwriting. I'm pretty sure she was literate. And so what it says here, she's appealing to the governor, asking to be sent wherever her husband is sent because she's destitute, which I think she might have been oversourcing it because by then she would have been taken care of by the government. But for some reason, that was approved, but for some reason she didn't go. She was reassigned to somebody else, and then she absconded for a couple of weeks and was back in the factory for a while. She served out her time, and the next that we know of her is in 1828, about the time she was given her freedom, and she was on the census in Newcastle. And by that time, she had another child, a little boy, a baby called Samuel. And he's the only one we don't know who his father is. She invented a father named Samuel Rigby, trying to pass herself off as Mrs. Rigby, but I'm pretty sure he didn't exist. And I thought that was curious, that she named the fathers of her other children, but not this one. And I don't know why that is, but I wonder whether it was a convict or whether she was into prostitution at that point. The other fathers that she named were free men who might have been able to help her in some way, but maybe this fellow didn't, or maybe she didn't know who he was. So she had her certificate of freedom, there's hers. But the following year she was caught stealing again. This time she stole ribbons from a shop, and the crime notes show that she was in the company of a teenager called Mary Ann Young, and I tracked her down. They were found in the home of Robert Young, who was Mary Ann's father, who was about Hannah's age and a really dodgy character. He was a convict, but he was the scourger at the jail. Convict constable, because they employed convicts to manage the convicts. And he seems like quite a womanizer too, so I can't help wondering what was going on there, and quite a violent man. But when they caught her, they went to the house and they found her holding a child and quickly stuffing the ribbons into the mouth of her child, obviously trying to hide them, but that didn't work. And then she said she just took them for a lark, which I don't think could have been true because she'd already sold some of the ribbons. I think she was doing it for money. But it just showed, it suggested to me a bit of a sort of a light, playful side of her nature, perhaps. Anyway, she was transported to Moreton Bay. The boys went with her. First, they went back to Sydney, and there's the shipping records that show Hannah Rigby, Robert Rigby, and Samuel Rigby on the ship back to Sydney. And then off they went from there to Moreton Bay. And it took me a little while to confirm it, but I did confirm that they both went with her. And the reason I really wanted to confirm that is because often, well, usually women convicts were only allowed to keep their babies until they were 3 years old. But Robert by this time was about 6, 5 going on 6. But he did go to Moreton Bay. They both went with her. And that's a sketch of Moreton Bay that was done in around 1831. So that was close to the time that she arrived there, which I think you can see the windmill up the top there, which is still there. Everything else pretty much, apart from this building, has changed. So that's something like what she would have seen when she arrived. She arrived just only a couple of days after Captain Logan was murdered. So it would have been a bit chaotic at the time, I imagine. So when she arrived, there weren't many women. There'd only been 3 women there until 1829. And when Hannah arrived, she was in a party of 8, brought the numbers up to 28. At that time, there were about 1,000 altogether, so all the rest of them were men, and 100 soldiers, and obviously lots more First Nations people. More women arrived later. So the women were kept apart from the men, but the free men and the military seem to have had very easy access, which the succession of governors complained about. There was even a spare key to the women's jail that was hidden outside, and everyone knew about it. The men could let themselves in. So lots of pregnancies resulted, and there were a few scandals involving some, high status men as well, and going in with the women. So lots of pregnancies, and Hannah's was one of them. She had another child, James, who was born in 1832, and she didn't name his father at the time, but it came up later, which Jennifer discovered. His father was James Hexton, who was a boat pilot, a free man, and because the son, born James Rigby, later in life was known as James Hexton, and that's a picture of him there. He was the only one of her sons who lived old to a great enough age to have his own children and have descendants, and 8 of the descendants turned up at my book launch last year, which was very exciting. And I was really pleased to see how far things have improved in that time, from her appalling life and conditions to this group of very obviously thriving women who, strong family connections and so on. It's quite heartwarming to see. So he lived long, and he wrote some of his reminiscences in an article in the newspaper when he was an old man, and you've got to take it with a grain of salt. But he clearly did know his father. He either made up or he had been told stories about him that are pretty almost, certainly not true. That he was a lieutenant in the British Navy, he'd fought with Nelson at Trafalgar. All these claims have been repeated over and over since then, but there's no evidence whatsoever, unless he had changed his name in the meantime. But I think more likely they were just stories. So he hints at a family life. He says he was born in a little cottage on the site where the GPO is today in 1914, which it still is. The site where the GPO is today was where the female factory was. So it was not a little cottage. I mean, he might have been born on that site, but he sort of hinted that it was a normal family life, but it wasn't. I don't know the extent of their relationship, but obviously it was enough for him to get to know his father. He didn't mention that his mother was a convict, it just slipped his mind, but that was nothing unusual. And whether he even knew, he probably did, but he wasn't repeating that story. His father also, I discovered, was not, even if they were in a relationship, it was not a monogamous one. He was based on Stradbroke Island and then Moreton Island. And when James, the son, was 7, the father had another child with an Aboriginal woman from Amity, and named that child Edward Petrie Hexton. So looking into that a bit further, it turns out he was great buddies with Andrew Petrie, who I'm sure a lot of you would know about, very significant Brisbane pioneering family. I went down to Sydney and had a look at so James Hexton, the father, the boat pilot, drowned, was at sea in a heavy coat, couldn't swim, and his intestacy file is held down in Sydney, and that told us a lot about, because, with an intestacy file, people were writing in explaining what their relationship was to this person and why they need to get money, why they are owed money from the estate. And so he wrote in Andrew Petrie wrote detailing their relationship. And it turns out when this little child, Edward Petrie Hexton, was a baby, James, the father, introduced him to Petrie and said, and they both agreed that it was a shame that this child should grow up wild. So Hexton asked Petrie to bring him up. So he brought him up with his family. There's no mention of what the mother thought of this. So he was known as Neddy. And it's a complicated situation because the father obviously loved the child and he even bought land for him to be held in trust for when he was an adult. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to claim that. It's round about where the Winter Garden is today. But the files also show a lot about his character. It seems like he was quite a charming, lovely person with great company, really disorganised, not interested in material things at all, and also a heavy drinker. I think that was a big part of problems. So anyway, that was a bit of a digression from Hannah's story, but it does show that they weren't a conventional monogamous couple. Hannah's sentence expired in 1837. She was off back to Sydney because you couldn't stay there if you were just an ordinary free civilian. I'm pretty sure she definitely went back with her 2 older sons, but possibly not the younger. And she immediately reoffended and was sent back to Moreton Bay. And it's during their second term that Dr. Ballow arrived and she was assigned his servant. And I think things maybe took a little bit of a turn for better at that point. Again, when she was in Sydney, what she stole was hats and fabric. She'd been working in a shop down there. Anyway, I know that the 2 older boys were with her in Sydney, and I know that they did not come back with her. They were too old to have been allowed back in the penal establishment. But what became of them for a few years, I haven't been able to find out. They didn't go to the orphan school. They were about 9 and 13 at the time, so they would have almost certainly been put out to work. Whether James came back with her, whether he was with her in Sydney, it's hard to say for sure, but he definitely grew up in Brisbane, so it's most likely that he stayed up here and lived the rest of his life up here. Anyway, so as I mentioned at the start, then when the settlement started closing down and they sent the women back, Hannah stayed, and then Dr. Ballow put in a good word for her, described her as her conduct as exemplary, never given me the slightest cause for distrust or complaint. And she was given her freedom at that point. So then Hannah was was separated from her older sons from about 1837. Robert seems to have married in Sydney in 1845, and I think he died soon after that. I haven't been able to say for sure which one he was. But in 1846, a letter appeared in the paper. Samuel Rigby, 18 years of age, native of this colony, supposed to be in the interior, is urgently requested to communicate with his parent the following address. Any letter knowing his present address would confer a great favour upon the sender, Hannah Rigby. And she's given a Sydney address, which was curious. And I tracked that down, and that was actually a girls' school at the time, so I can't help wondering whether she had gone looking for him and was maybe working there for a little while. But I don't know for sure. Anyway, the good news is the following year, Samuel Rigby was on his way up to Moreton Bay, so they would have reunited. But the bad news is that he was probably the Samuel who died not long after that, still a young man in Brisbane. Hannah lived in Queen Street, or near Queen Street, until her death in 1853. She had a very rough life, but she went out on what you might be able to call a high note. She partied too hard. She clearly developed a drinking habit by that point, and honestly, who wouldn't, with the life that she'd had. And she went out to a wedding, a neighbour's wedding, and was reported to have been partaking in the cheer rather enthusiastically. And the next day she went home. She went home after the wedding, but the next day she was found dead. The inquest findings said it was an act of God, but also suggested intemperance might have been a factor. The newspapers and her death certificate, well, not certificate, but the register said that she was 77, and that has been repeated throughout the years, but she couldn't have been. She was at most maybe 59 or 60. So she must have had a really rough life. So, you know, people were thinking she was about 77. And I have to say, I wrote an article for Traces magazine a while ago, and I put the correct information in, and the editor started it off saying the 77-year-old Hannah Rigby died, without checking with me. So if you're reading that, it's not my mistake. If you read the article all up, it doesn't make sense internally when you add the dates up. So anyway, that's my little beef. Just wanted to say it wasn't my mistake. So yeah, that's Hannah's story, and I do have copies up there for sale, and some of my other books as well, which I'll just show you up here. These are all, 3 of these are non-fiction. That's Ship of Death that I was telling you about earlier, the Stradbroke story. This one is about one of the 2 bushrangers known as Captain Starlight, who was the lesser known one that we all know of, Harry Redford, who stole the cattle and got away with it. But this is the other guy who was just such a great, he was a gift for a writer, such an audacious person, serial imposter, shot a policeman, escaped the noose, and yeah, great story. That's The Killer's Game. And the other one, The 3 Times Buried, is the only one so far which has been fictionalised. So that's a story set in Scotland of a murder committed in 1827 by my husband's ancestor. And I just loved that atmosphere of that poverty-stricken 19th century Aberdeenshire farm. I thought, yeah, I'll fictionalise this one and give them all thoughts and feelings and dialogue and atmosphere. So, yeah, and they're all up there if anyone wants to have a little browse or buy any. And now, do we have any questions? Thank you.